The February fog lay thick along the Thames that night, muffling the city's usual clatter and turning the lamps along the Victoria Embankment into dim halos hovering in midair. I had just drawn the curtain against that damp, creeping chill at Baker Street when Mrs. Hudson announced a visitor, her voice carrying that particular note of unease I had come to recognize as heralding something out of the ordinary. Our caller was a barrel-chested man in his late 50s with a weather-beaten face, clean-shaven, his graying hair combed back as if in concession to respectability without quite achieving it. His clothes, though plain, were neat, and his cap was clutched respectfully in both hands. But it was his eyes that struck me most, steady, sober, and full of a kind of stubborn dread. Holmes's gaze swept over him in a single, comprehensive appraisal. "You are the proprietor, not the customer," he said. "Your hands are used to pulling beer and polishing brass, not to lifting crates. The river smell clings to you, but not in the way of the lighterman. You come, then, from one of the public houses along the Embankment. Something has happened there which your regulars attribute to ghosts, your staff are too frightened to work through, and your wife thinks will ruin you if it reaches the newspapers." The man's mouth fell open for a brief moment before he gave a strangled sort of laugh. "That's about the size of it, sir. Tom Barstow, at your service. I run the Anchor's Rest, just by the steps down to the river, between Waterloo Bridge and the station. And if I don't get help soon, I'll be running it alone. No one wants to set foot in a haunted cellar." Before I continue with this remarkable case, please subscribe to Detective Sherlock if you haven't already. Your support allows us to keep bringing these mysteries to you. Now, let us proceed. Holmes gestured him to a chair. "Tell us everything, Mr. Barstow. Start with the first incident." Barstow cleared his throat, still looking as if he half expected Holmes to produce the details himself. "It's the ghost, sir," he said. "Or what everyone says is a ghost. 2 weeks ago, just before closing time, old Joe Miller, been coming to the Rest every night these 20 years, was upstairs by the big window that looks onto the river. He'd had his usual 2 pints, maybe 3, and he swore blind he saw a man in a dark coat standing outside in the fog, staring in at him. Nothing strange in that, you might say. Only he said the man's face was white as paper, and the river was lapping over his shoes as if he were standing in the Thames itself, though the pavement's a good 10 feet up from the water. Joe called out, pointed, made a fuss. When me and the lads went to look, there was no one there. Well, we laughed it off at first. Said Joe'd had one too many, or his eyes were playing tricks in the fog. But the next night..." He paused, his hands tightening on his cap. "The next night, Maisie, my barmaid, screamed blue murder from the cellar. We ran down, and she was huddled in the corner by the barrels, sobbing and pointing. She swore she'd seen a man standing by the river door, the one that opens on the steps down to the water. Said he was dripping wet, leaving no puddles, and when she asked who was there, he said, clear as anything, 'Tell Barstow he owes me a drink and a life.' Then he faded into the dark," she says. "Just gone. Since then," he went on, "folk have heard footsteps where no one's walking, seen a figure at the Embankment window, felt cold spots, glasses toppling when no one's near. 2 nights ago, a customer bolted out the door after saying he saw a man's face look back at him from the mirror behind the bar, standing where no one was standing. It's bad enough losing trade to the stories, Mr. Holmes. But last night, it stopped being stories." Holmes, who had been listening with eyes half closed, opened them fully. "Someone is dead, then?" Barstow nodded miserably. "Young Alfie, my potboy. We found him at the foot of the river steps, head cracked on the lower landing. Police say he slipped, fell in the dark. only he don't go down there without orders, and I told him clear to keep out. And there were bruises on his arms as if someone had grabbed him. Maisie says she heard him talking to someone just before, but when she went to look, only Alfie was there, lying at the bottom. Holmes rose, the languor gone from his movements. You did right to come. Ghosts are seldom the only ones with something to hide. Tell me, Mr. Barstow, who owned the Anchor's Rest before you? My father, Barstow said, and before him, his uncle. It's been in the family as long as I can remember. And in all that time, no talk of hauntings until a fortnight ago? Barstow shook his head, then hesitated. Well, there's always tales, sir. Any place by the river has 'em. Drowned men, smugglers, all that. But not like this. Not with faces people know. Not with names. Names? Holmes asked sharply. Joe Miller said he recognized the ghost, Barstow said reluctantly. He said it looked like Billy Kerrigan, a lighterman who used to drink at the Rest regular. Only Billy's been dead these 3 years. Drowned in a storm, they said. Boat went over near the bridge. They never found the body. Ah, Holmes said softly. Now we approach the heart of it. Very well, Mr. Barstow. Dr. Watson and I shall come to your public house this evening. We will require a room overlooking the river, access to your cellar, and introductions to your staff and regulars. Until then, say nothing of our involvement. Ghosts feed on talk as much as on fear. The Anchor's Rest stood exactly where Barstow had said, a solid 3-story brick building fronting the embankment, its curtained windows glowing amber in the gloom. The sign creaked slightly in the wind, its painted anchor and frothing tankard looking almost jaunty despite the gloomy tales surrounding it. The river, broad and black, moved sluggishly beyond the stone balustrade, the lights from the opposite bank breaking into wavering shards on its surface. Inside, the pub was close and warm, smelling of beer, coal smoke, and wet wool. A low murmur of conversation died almost entirely as Holmes and I entered behind Barstow. Eyes turned toward us, with that mixture of curiosity and suspicion that marks any tight-knit group confronted with outsiders. Holmes's gaze flicked once around the room, noting faces, positions, the way conversation clustered and ebbed. Barstow introduced us as potential investors interested in river properties, a fiction Holmes had suggested on the way, and we were shown to a corner table from which we could see both the large front window and the long bar with its mirror behind. The mirror, I noticed, was old and slightly foxed at the edges, throwing back a subtly distorted image of the room. Holmes ordered a modest supper, more to allay suspicion than from hunger, then sat, apparently relaxed, his fingers lightly drumming the tabletop in a rhythm only his mind understood. I, at his request, made the acquaintance of our neighbors. Joe Miller proved to be a lean, wiry man in his 60s, his face creased by sun, wind, and years of squinting at the river's currents. His hands were scarred, his fingers knotted by old breaks. He wore a cap pulled low and nursed his pint with the gratitude of one who has known true thirst. "Ghost, is it?" he said when I prompted him gently. "Aye, I saw summat that night. Man standing outside that very window, fog all round him but clear as day, staring in. Face whiter than foam, eyes like he was seeing summat far beyond. I know Billy Kerrigan when I see him, Doctor. Drunk or sober, ghost or flesh. And that was him." "How certain are you?" I asked. "Could the fog have
"Don't you start with the fog," Joe snapped. "I've watched this river through more kinds of fog than you've had hot dinners. I know what I saw."
Maisie, the barmaid, was younger, no more than 22, with dark hair pinned hurriedly and a quick, bird-like glance that never seemed to settle in one place for long. Her hands moved deftly among glasses and bottles, but when I mentioned the cellar, she paled. "I won't go down there alone," she said flatly. "Not for double wages. I heard him, I did. A voice by the river door. Tell Barstow he owes me a drink and a life." My lantern went out just then. When I got it lit again, there was no one there, but I could hear water dripping off something, like off a coat. And there were wet footprints, only they stopped before they reached the stairs. Holmes, who had drawn nearer during this exchange, interjected. "What sort of footprints, Miss Maisie?" She shivered. "Bare ones," she said. "Like a man with no boots, no socks. That's what made my skin crawl most." Holmes's eyes gleamed almost imperceptibly. "Very interesting. Mr. Barstow, show us this cellar of yours." The cellar was reached by a narrow stair behind the bar, the walls damp and flaking, the air cool and heavy with the smell of spilled beer and old stone. Barstow led the way, holding a lantern high. At the bottom, the space widened into a low, vaulted chamber lined on one side with barrels and on the other with crates, broken chairs, and assorted detritus. At the far end, a heavy wooden door, reinforced with iron bands, stood bolted. Beyond it, I knew, lay the slippery steps down to the water, a convenient arrangement for receiving casks by boat in earlier days. Holmes's lantern beam swept the floor. "Here," he murmured, crouching. "See, Watson? Scratches along the stone. Frequent traffic between the barrels and the river door. Yet your trade, I gather, is mostly served from deliveries by road these days." Barstow nodded. "Hardly ever bring casks up from the water now. Too much trouble. Last time was months ago." "And the door?" Holmes asked. "Is it always kept bolted?" "Since Maisie's fright and the boy's fall, aye," Barstow said. "Before that, we kept it locked at night, but sometimes it'd be open in the day for fresh air. Might have been left on the latch a time or two, I don't mind saying." Holmes examined the bolts and hinges with minute attention, then moved to the walls, his fingers tracing along the mortar. "There was once another way in and out of here," he said after a time. "See the discoloration, Watson? And here, the faint outline of an arch now bricked up. A smuggler's passage, perhaps, or an old drain. The embankment's construction sealed many such relics of the old riverside." He stood and walked slowly back toward the stairs, then stopped midway. Above us, the muffled sounds of the pub filtered down. Laughter, the clink of glass, someone starting a song. Holmes tilted his head, listening, then smiled. "Barstow, tell me, have any of your regulars had cause to bear you ill will in the past few years? Any disputes, debts unpaid, men barred from the premises?" Barstow shifted uneasily. "Well, now that's a hard question for a landlord. You get plenty of arguments over cards or women, but nothing that sticks in my mind. Except Billy, of course. But he's dead." "Flesh is dead," Holmes said softly. "But a man's story may remain very much alive. Tell me about Billy Kerrigan." Barstow hesitated, then sighed. "Billy was a lighterman, tough sort, knew the river like his own face. He had a temper, right enough, but he was fair. Paid his tab, never started trouble he couldn't finish. 3 years ago,
a foggy night in March, his boat went over. Folks said he must have misjudged the current, hit a pier. By the time anyone realized he was missing, the tide had him. They never found the body. And before that, Holmes pressed. Barstow looked irritated. If you're asking if I wronged the man, I didn't. He owed a bit now and then, but nothing serious.
The only real row we had was over that card game. Holmes's eyes sharpened. What card game? Barstow rubbed the back of his neck. It was the week before he died. A game of whist went on in the snug. Billy, Joe Miller, and two gents from up the Strand. One of them, Mr. Hargreaves, bit of a toff, had money to burn. There was more cash on that table than I like seeing in my house. Drinks were flowing, stakes went up. Come closing, Hargreaves was in deep. Billy had his IOUs. They argued. Hargreaves accused Billy of cheating. Billy took offense. I had to throw them both out in the end. And afterwards? Holmes asked. Next day, Hargreaves comes back, quiet-like, and offers me a tidy sum for Billy's bits of paper, Barstow admitted. Said Billy would never see the money anyway, that it was only right he get a chance to clear his honor. I said I didn't want to be mixed up in it, but he pressed. Times were tight. I sold him the IOUs. Billy never knew. Week later, Billy's dead. Holmes regarded him steadily. And you think no one noticed? Memories are long in a riverside pub, Mr. Barstow, especially when a man dies owing money. Barstow's shoulders slumped. I thought it was all done and gone. But when Maisie said the ghost told her I owed him a drink and a life, well, it sounded like Billy's kind of talk. Holmes decided, then and there, that we would spend the rest of the evening at the Anchor's Rest. We took rooms upstairs, arranging with Barstow to leave the river door unbolted that night, but to let no one know. Holmes wished to see who might be using it. Around 11, as customers drifted home and the pub gradually emptied, Holmes stationed himself near the back stair while I sat at a table with Joe Miller, nursing a pint I scarcely tasted. Maisie polished glasses with exaggerated slowness, shooting nervous glances at the window. It was perhaps 10 minutes before closing when the room grew noticeably colder. A hush fell, conversation dying mid-sentence. I felt the fine hairs on the back of my neck stir. In the mirror behind the bar, where bottles and faces reflected in shabby glamour, another image appeared. A man in a dark coat, his hair slicked to his head, his skin oddly pale. His eyes, hollow and fixed, seemed to look not at the room, but through it. For a moment, it was as if the river itself had risen to the glass. "Billy," Joe whispered hoarsely. Maisie dropped a glass. It shattered on the floor, making everyone in the room jump. In that instant, the figure in the mirror was gone. At the same moment, I heard, faintly but distinctly, the creak of a door somewhere below and the soft pad of footsteps on stone. Holmes was already moving. He slipped through the back, down the cellar stairs, silent as smoke. I followed as quickly as I dared, my heart hammering. In the cellar, the lantern Barstow had left burning cast a wavering circle of light. The river door was ajar, a line of blackness slicing through the stone. Beside it stood a man, startled mid-step. A man in a dark coat, water dripping from his sleeves and pooling silently at his feet. He held an object in one hand, a long, narrow lantern with a shuttered front, its glass smeared with something that glowed faintly in the dimness. For a heartbeat, with the wet coat and lantern halo, he did look like a revenant risen from the Thames. Then Holmes's hand closed on his wrist in a vice-like grip. "Mr. Hargreaves," Holmes said pleasantly. "You are late. The dead have been waiting." The man jerked, tried to wrench free, but Holmes twisted his arm expertly, sending the lantern clattering to the floor. It skidded, its shutter slamming open.
Strange greenish light spilled across the stones, casting grotesque shadows. Maisie, who had followed us halfway, screamed. Joe Miller, peering down from the top of the stairs, made the sign of the cross. "Phosphorescent paint," Holmes said calmly, kicking the lantern aside, applied in a thin film to the mirror and certain strategic surfaces. When lit by this lantern's peculiar wavelength, it would reveal exactly the image you wished the patrons to see. A ghost reflected where you were not. Hargreaves, sweating now, glared. "You don't understand." "I understand perfectly," Holmes cut in. "You lost a great deal of money to Billy Kerrigan, money you did not have. When Billy drowned, you rejoiced to think his claim was buried with him. Then you learned that Barstow had sold you out, that he had handed you over as a debtor to a dead man. You could not forgive that, nor could you resist the temptation his weakness presented. You saw a way to frighten him, to ruin his business, to drive him to desperate acts, perhaps to sell the pub to you at a discount, or to someone else in your pay." Hargreaves's lips thinned. "That drunken fool had no right." Holmes tightened his grip until the man hissed. "So you created a ghost," he went on. "You used your knowledge of stage lighting. You were, after all, a silent partner in that riverside theater on the South Bank. You had access to chemical paints and lanterns. You crept into this cellar by the river door at night, smeared phosphorescent mixtures on the mirror behind the bar and here along the walls. Then, at chosen moments, you shone your special lantern up from the cellar or outside the pub, illuminating only the prepared surfaces. The rest you left to fog, reflection, and frightened imaginations." "And the voice?" I asked. Maisie heard someone speak. "Ventriloquism," Holmes said. "Crude, but effective in a dark cellar with a single, nervous listener. Mr. Hargreaves has a theatrical background, do not forget. A few well-chosen words about owing a drink and a life, words Billy himself might have used, and the legend writes itself." Hargreaves spat on the floor. "You make it sound simple. It wasn't. Took weeks to prepare, nights of work, waiting for fog thick enough to do the rest." And it was working. Trade was dropping. Barstow was losing his grip. Another month, and he'd have been begging me to take this place off his hands. "And the boy?" Holmes asked quietly. "Alfie. Did you push him down the steps or merely frighten him so he stumbled?" Hargreaves' eyes flickered. "He saw me, that's all," he said. "Wasn't supposed to. He came down unexpected while I was at the door. I tried to hush him. He panicked, pulled away, lost his footing. It was an accident. I never meant to kill a child." Holmes's face hardened. "Ghosts seldom intend their victims either, but the result is the same. Murder by neglect, murder by greed. Call it what you will." Upstairs, Inspector Lestrade arrived with 2 constables, summoned by a messenger Holmes had dispatched earlier, in case of complications. Hargreaves was taken into custody, the lantern and its eerie paint carefully collected as evidence. The mirror behind the bar, scrubbed free of its faint glowing film, reflected only ordinary faces once more. As the excitement died down, and the shaken regulars began to drift home with tales they would no doubt be repeating for years, Holmes sat at a corner table with Barstow, Maisie, and Joe Miller. The river's steady susurration outside provided a low accompaniment. "So there was no ghost," Barstow said finally, rubbing his temples. "Just a man with paint and a fancy lamp." "A man," Holmes said, "with a grudge, a knowledge of human fear, and an unfortunate talent for suggestion. That is more dangerous than any phantom, Mr. Barstow." Ghosts take what the living give them. This one took advantage of your guilt over those IOUs. He knew you had wronged Billy Kerrigan, even if only in a small way. He counted on your conscience to do half his work. Barstow looked stricken. I thought it was all forgotten. A bit of paper, that's all. Paper can carry more weight than a man imagines, Holmes said. In future, you might be more cautious whose debts you sell and whose honor you trade. Maisie, still pale but calmer, asked,
Then what about Joe? And me? We both saw something.
You saw what you expected to see, Holmes said, without unkindness. A fleeting shape in fog, a reflected smudge in dim glass, given form by fear and stories. Once Hargreaves began his theatrics, every draft became a ghost's breath, every creak a phantom footstep. Your minds did the rest. That is no shame to you. It is how most hauntings are born. Joe Miller sniffed. Don't feel like nothing to be proud of all the same. I'll never hear the end of it downriver. Oh, I dare say you will, Holmes said dryly. But consider this, Mr. Miller. You recognized a face in that mirror. Not the face of a ghost, but of an old wrong. In your way, you were as much a part of unmasking this fraud as any of us. The Anchor's Rest gradually returned to normal in the weeks that followed, though the tale of the Embankment ghost still surfaced whenever new customers needed amusing or frightening. Holmes declined Barstow's offer of free ale for life, but accepted, with some satisfaction, a framed copy of the pub's old sign as a memento of the case. Some months later, as we walked together along the Victoria Embankment itself, past Cleopatra's Needle and the benches where lovers and idlers sat watching the river, I mentioned the case again. Do you ever tire, I asked, of explaining away ghosts, Holmes? Of turning spectres into men with paint and lanterns? Holmes smiled slightly, his gaze following the slow-moving water. My dear Watson, the world is filled with enough genuine darkness without adding imaginary phantoms to the tally. When people blame ghosts, they stop looking for the men who smile behind them. Hargreaves would have ruined Barstow, perhaps killed again, all behind the mask of a wronged river spirit. By stripping away the mask, we do more than solve the puzzle. We remind people that responsibility cannot be exercised with incense and stories. And yet, I said, Joe Miller still swears he saw Billy's face. Holmes's eyes twinkled. Perhaps he did, he said. Memory is a curious thing. Mirrors are not the only glass that holds old images. If Joe sees Billy raising a pint in that reflection from time to time, and if it makes him think twice about debts, friendship, and the river's capricious mercy, perhaps that particular ghost may be allowed to linger. This, then, was the case of the ghost at the Embankment pub. A haunting with no spirit, a murder without a weapon in the usual sense, and a reminder that the most frightening apparitions in London are not those that rise from the Thames, but those that emerge from bruised pride, unpaid debts, and the theatrical imagination of a man who thinks fear is a tool to be used, rather than a warning to be heeded.